I got drawn in or sort of into the subject about what happens after the fire, and I just want to share some experience with you.
I learn so much by talking to other people that I meet, and I make really long-standing connections.
Pouring water onto an EV in thermal runaway is like pouring water onto the roof of your house when your kitchen's on fire. Thank you, gentlemen.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm going to talk about some research that we've been doing over the last, couple of years now. Going to get a little bit technical. There's been a lot of work on this, and so I'm only going to be able to give a sort of general summary. This was a team effort, so I'm talking on behalf of a whole group of us who did work on this. Particularly, there was Dr. Anne Templeton at the University of Edinburgh, and a colleague of mine, Steve Gwynn, at Movement Strategies. There was various other people involved as well, but we were sort of the key members of that team. We've talked a lot about Grenfell. We've talked about Dame Hackett's review, and part of that was to do further research in the approved documents. And a particular project then was called up from MHCLG at the time, DLA, be it the Building Safety Regulator, was commissioned some work to evaluate evacuation strategies using a robust modelling approach, considering the effectiveness of physical design measures, but also including the impact of public confidence and perceptions. So this was quite an interesting project because it wasn't just about kind of modelling and sort of the engineering side, but it was looking at people's perceptions of building safety, perceptions of the stay put policy. And this is where particularly Anne came in as a psychologist, and a couple of the students she got involved was really key to this project, of that understanding of not just the engineering side, but also that person side of the equation. So, as I talked about, there's various consortium members. So, as I show in this diagram here, there's what we call the simulation track, so the modelling side of it, and then there was the behaviour track. And we wanted to make sure that those two things overlap. So what we did in the modelling, tried to bring in the things we learned from the surveys, the both in-person surveys and online surveys, in terms of the sort of perceptions of and behaviour that we might expect from people in an event of a fire in their residential high-rise building. So I'm not going to walk through all the details in the table, but there was interviews and surveys of residents in high-rise residential buildings, and as I say, it's about understanding their confidence and their understanding of the stay put policy and their confidence in that guidance, how much they believed that the guidance was applicable to them and their building. And so from Anne's work, she put together a whole bunch of different questions, and from there we can pull out some interesting findings in terms of people's how much they agree with the guidance, how much they had trust in the guidance, how much they trust the people who wrote the guidance, and also then an evaluation of whether they thought their building was safe and the guidance was appropriate to them. So we could use that information in terms of the modelling that I'm going to talk about. And then they looked at not just how much they trusted the guidance, but how much they were then willing to follow that guidance. So were they willing to follow the stay put guidance? Did they have a positive sort of feeling about it in terms of them and their building, or did they have a sort of a negative opinion? So from that we could draw out a whole bunch of event tables that said if they had a fire in their building or they heard an alarm, what would they do? What percentage might stay put? What percentage would evacuate? And then look at what they might do next. Would they warn their neighbours? Would they communicate in face-to-face, or would they use some kind of social media to contact their neighbours? And so this can create a kind of cascade of information through the building. So that one person, they have a fire in their flat, they might decide to stay put or leave. They may communicate that to other members of the building, and their reactions would then cascade through the building. So some of our modelling tried to kind of look at this cascade reaction that might happen. We did a whole bunch of evacuation modelling. We used a couple of different tools. I'm not going to talk about it in particular detail. And from there, we set up a whole range of simulations. So in total, we carried out 14,000 simulations, looking at a whole range of different variables. And from that, we had to do what we call a baseline analysis, some sensitivity analysis, and then do a whole bunch of parameters, which I'll speak to in a moment, looking at all the different combinations of building height, building stair widths, and various other factors. And from that, we could draw out a whole bunch of findings in terms of the modelling, but incorporating, I say, these elements of what we've learned from our surveys. So in terms of building configurations, we looked at a range of footprints. Some of them were compliant with ADB, some of them were non-compliant. We pushed the envelope to see what happened if we had buildings outside of the expectations of ADB. We had different heights of buildings based on the various trigger heights you'll find in ADB. We went as high as 140 metres tall, which was at the point we're doing this project, the highest proposed building here in London. We looked at different corridor lengths. We included lifts or not in the modelling. We also looked at the idea of amenity spaces, so having public spaces in our residential building and how that might interact with the people in their dwellings. In terms of the fire scenario, we kept this very simple but also quite challenging, and it kind of addresses what sort of Ben's been talking about of some kind of building failure. So obviously, in this case here, in terms of a challenging fire, we want to look at smoke that moved around the building, that obviously left the apartment, potentially got into the corridor, potentially got into the stairs, and potentially filled the rest of the building. And you've got to sort of get a balance there. And obviously, if you just said, let's fill the building with smoke immediately, in terms of evacuation, well, there is no evacuation. And if you had it said it took many hours, then it's not particularly challenging. So we come up with a scenario which was sufficiently challenging to challenge that building, but not be kind of silly at two ends of the spectrum. I'm not going to talk through all the detail there, but the idea was to look at smoke progressively moving around the building as it moved through, particularly through fire doors, smoke doors. There would be a delay, and then it would move to another part of the building. In terms of stair provisions, of course, one of the questions which has been debated, or at the time was being discussed, about one stairs or two stairs. So we had one stair and two stair buildings, varied the stair width. We had some assumptions about the way that people would evacuate the building, and we would also, in two stair buildings, have assumptions that people would transfer from a stair that had smoke in it into an unaffected stair. So we allow people to navigate their way out of the building if they could do, if they were still in the stairs or wanted to try and enter the stairs, realise it was smoky, and there was an alternative if it was available in the two stair buildings. Now, we had to obviously consider the capabilities of our simulated occupants. We had to then appreciate that some people were going to have movement impairments. In some cases, those movement impairments, they could still self-evacuate. And in some cases, we would have what we call movement-dependent persons. In other words, they need someone else to help them evacuate. I mean, the classic picture there is a person in the wheelchair. We know that some people can self-evacuate, but we've got this idea that someone needs to be aided. We had to then provide percentages for the different proportions, and then looked at different walking speeds to try and account for those movement impairment issues in terms of our modelling. The other thing we wanted to do was look at a whole range of different alert systems. So we wanted to look at, and also whether people are awake or is asleep. So we looked at voice alarms, bells. We looked at when you had an in-person action or someone knocking on your door. You may have fire and rescue service personnel who are communicating, and that will affect in terms of your movement delay. And you may get smoke cues, something that tells you there's likely a fire. So using the various resources in the literature, you can come up with average times for our movement pre-evacuation delay. And then we wanted to look at it in terms of both impaired and unimpaired people, where we include the fact that when someone's got a movement impairment, they may require extra time to get themselves in a situation they're able to evacuate. Some of you might be familiar with British Standard PD 7974, and in there's the classic diagram, and you'll find it in various other documents, where we can break down our evacuation into a number of component parts. So there's the movement part, and there's what we call the pre-evacuation delay. And within that, we can break that down into smaller component elements. So you'll see in the standard, you'll talk about recognition time and response time. Now, we wanted in our modelling to break that down into some smaller elements, particularly when we're looking at the communication that might go on between one occupant and another. So they might be aware that there's a fire, they might hear an alarm or they see a smoke cue, start their activity that says, I think I'm going to escape, and at that point they may communicate with someone else in the building. They might go onto a WhatsApp or whatever, but they haven't finished their own sort of delay. So that allowed us to sort of incorporate the fact that people are going to communicate while they're still sort of in that activity of starting their escape, not necessarily when they've got out of the building, I think I'll tell my neighbour there's a problem. So we've broken that down into a number of smaller elements. And then what we've done is, because we've done this with a probabilistic type approach, with each of these we've assigned a distribution. So the time it takes for someone to wake up, the time it takes them to realise there's a fire, the time it takes to make contact with their neighbours, each of those is based on a probabilistic. So we've run these simulations many, many times, sampling different values for our pre-movement time, sampling different values for our walking speeds, and that provides us with a statistical point of view in terms of our modelling. Again, there's too much to read here, but what we also wanted to do is look at different combinations of alarm, notification and detection. So we looked at where you might have heat detectors, you might have smoke detectors. Do you have them in the flat? Do you have them in the means of escape? Do you provide a voice alarm? Do you provide a bell? Each of those have different factors in terms of how quickly the fire might be detected and how quickly someone might respond. Typically, the literature will say that people respond to a voice alarm quicker than a tone alarm. Typically, smoke alarms will detect fires quicker than heat alarms. And one of the other presenters already talked about the fact that heat alarms, react slower but more likely to be in the event of a real fire. And so then what we've done is broken that down into a whole bunch of actions that says, okay, people hear something, they might then contact the fire brigade, they may decide to escape, they may stay put, they may get new information which will then change their mind again. So they might initially say they're going to stay put, but some other piece of information comes from them, they go, I think now there's enough information that I'm going to evacuate. So we've tried to incorporate those sort of behavioural elements in terms of information that comes to our people, to the people in the building, and what decisions they then make after that. So, lots of variables that we put in, and then we've got a whole bunch of findings. I think one of the most important things, I don't think this is particularly a surprise, is the modern means of communication are changing the way that buildings work. The fact that we've all got mobile phones, the fact that we've got means of communicating within our building and outside of the building, so you get information that someone's outside of the building and realises their building's on fire, they may come back to the building, they may have ways of communicating. That is changing the dynamics of buildings in terms of the information you get, and the fact that many, many years ago you could have a fire in a building and other people weren't aware about it until the next day. Now people are very much aware about it, and that changes their behaviour. So early automatic detection may impact on the number of people who decide to evacuate rather than stay put. And this might put extra demand on the common means of escape. Social media reporting may complicate evacuation strategies. So from the modelling, you get kind of not some big surprises here in terms of voice alarm and tone alarm, so that voice alarm, your people will evacuate quicker, so total evacuation times are reduced compared with not having an alarm, but in terms of having a tone alarm, it takes a bit longer. If you look at different heights of buildings, it didn't make much difference. Again, that's not particularly surprising. But if you relied on what we call the social notification, so in other words, you had this cascade where people would just communicate with each other, you wouldn't get, in our scenario, a total evacuation before the fire or the smoke compromised the building. So you end up with a number of people that potentially become casualties. In terms of stair width, can provide adequate means of escape where they act as a place of safety. So remember, you might have the opportunity for people to get into the stairs. If you can keep your stairs as a means of a place of safety, then they should have adequate time to evacuate. It's only if you can get fire products into the stairs that this really starts to become a challenge. If we looked at what we call extreme stair demand, in other words, we assumed that everyone became aware of the fire at the same time and everyone immediately evacuated, it's not particularly realistic, but if we assume that, then we could look at the effect of stair width in sort of more detail. If we include pre-movement time, then actually the stair width doesn't make much difference, because some people start moving early, some people move late, but they don't put demand on the stairs. If we assume that everyone enters the stairs at the same time, then kind of again, not surprisingly, if you make the stairs wider to a certain point, it is a benefit to evacuation. If you make the stairs wider and wider and wider, you get to a point it makes no difference, because you haven't got enough people to kind of fill the stairs. So wider stairs have some benefits, but they may have some others that we didn't look at because we weren't looking particularly at fire and rescue services. So as Ben was talking about in terms of if the fire and rescue services are coming in and wanting to stage for firefighting, then a wider stair might provide an additional benefit over and above the evacuation effects. We then looked at multiple stairs, kind of not surprising again. If you assume that everyone goes into the stairs at the same time, having more stairs reduces the evacuation time. Not particularly surprising. But again, if you look at it in terms of where people are going to have delays because of having to respond to the alarm, having to decide to evacuate or not, then you will find that having the extra stairs doesn't really have a greater benefit, because in the end, it doesn't really matter about the number of stairs. I'll keep moving. The other thing we want to look at was the benefits of lifts, or the effect of lifts. And I think really one of the most important things, and again, none of these things are particularly surprising, but lifts give those people with impairments a means of escape. In the end, when we're talking about one stair or two stair, the simple question comes up is, if someone can't use stairs to evacuate, having another stair doesn't help them. But where we might be able to help them is providing them means of escape through lifts. Now, there are kind of complications here in terms of how you manage the evacuation. How do you prioritise who should be able to use a lift? Where does the lift go? And how do you deal with the fact that there may be other residents who could use the stairs but may decide that they want to use the lift? So, but the real benefit is if you allow the people who can't use the stairs to use the lift, obviously you help those people evacuate, but you also take those people away from potentially causing delays on the stairs. So it gives a benefit to the people who can and will use the stairs and allowing them to escape quicker as well. So we looked at the buildings in terms of whether you provide a single lift or two lifts, What it did in terms of the people who required the lifts, what we call the movement dependent persons, and those who could use the stairs, and you'll see we get those reductions for both parties in terms of evacuation. Again, what we find is adding more and more lifts doesn't add more and more benefit. It becomes a diminishing return, and you can see it when you look at these various plots in terms of the number of lifts and the benefit that may accrue. I try to keep this really quick because I realise we're going to be time, sometimes I can talk too much. There is a lot of stuff if you want to read about it. There's the full set of reports, over 500 pages, now available on the government website. There's a whole bunch of different research papers and conference papers if you wanted to read more. I've kept that nice and short. So, thank you.
Excellent.